Welcome to Open Minds Radio with Alejandro Rojas. Open Minds Radio is your UFO news authority, presenting evidence and the latest news regarding the UFO phenomenon. Here's your host, Alejandro Rojas.
Hello, everybody. It's Alejandro. Thank you, Mr. Dean. I love to hear Mr. Robert Dean introduce us every week. We have another great show. You know, one thing that's been fun lately, I guess it's always fun, and it's something that struck me when I got into UFO research, all of the really cool people that you get to meet. I think, you know, in this crowd, you know, there's some people that maybe you feel uncomfortable to be around, to put it nicely, when you go to these groups and stuff like that. But then there's also some really cool, like, people. I mean, just open-minded, extremely intelligent people. And our guest is one of these. It's Mack Maloney. He wrote the book UFOs in Wartime, and he is just a really great guy. He's an author, and he writes books that are kind of like Tom Clancy, and that's kind of how he puts it. They're the military fiction, thrillers. I used to read a lot of Tom Clancy when I was younger, actually. And so those are the kind of books that he writes, but he decided, because he's always been into UFOs, to write a UFO nonfiction book. And, of course, since he's a military guy, he focused on wartime, mostly focusing on, like, the last century, but he has cases that go way back. So we're going to talk to him a lot about UFOs, not just the Foo Fighters in World War II, but we're also talking Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. I was going to say Iran, and instead I said Iraq, and then it came out kind of Minnesotan. Iran. But it was Iraq, actually, I was trying to say, because he didn't get into later on in Iraq and stuff. But we'll talk all about that. So it's a great show, great interview, and I'm happy to have you all with us today. Another thing I want to mention, and you can't forget about, is the UFO Congress, because that is coming up, and it's going to be another great time. We have, out of some of the bigger name, like regular guys in the field, but it's cool to have them all together. Colin Andrews, we're going to have Stephen Greer, we'll have Whitley Strieber. I mean, all of these guys in one place, so that's really cool. Also, some of the newer people, you know, that have come on to, or at least lately been making a big splash. We have Lee Spiegel, who writes for the Huffington Post. He's been writing these great stories. We have Bryce Zabel, who's been on the show a few times. He's done a lot of movies, and he can talk about Hollywood and stuff like that. We have Ben Hansen from Fact or Fake, which is a lot of fun. He is a super cool guy. We had him on the show, and we've talked to him here and there. He's become one of our buddies, so excited about that. Some old friends, Yvonne Smith. This is a cool one. Robert Pinotti, who runs kind of the MUFON of Italy out there, and he has actually worked with the government and out there in Italy, so he's had a lot more inroads with the government than we've been able to have out here in the United States. Isn't that typical, unfortunately? We're going to have Travis Walton again, but he's going to be with John Goulet, and this is exciting because this is one of the other witnesses who was in the truck who saw the UFO, who took off because they were freaked out and came back, and he's a guy who has not talked in public like this before, so it's going to be the first time you'll be able to see this witness. So you'll be able, you know, if you're a skeptic of the case, you can see how these guys match up and how their stories match up. We'll have Bruce Maccabee, of course, famous scientist, UFO researcher, Randall Nickerson, which is a lot of fun. One of our first issues, we had a story on this guy because he's doing a documentary on the famous Zimbabwe UFO case where back when these kids saw a UFO and an alien, and it was a bunch of kids in Zimbabwe, and now they're older, so he's doing a documentary. They're like in their 20s or something, not too long ago. Rosemary Ann Guiley, a paranormal specialist. This guy, Antonio Huneeus, he's amazing. You've heard him before. David Cerrito, we're going to have talking about 2012. Jaime Musan is going to talk about 2012 in Mexico cases. Everybody loves Jaime. He wasn't there last year. A lot of people missed him, so he'll be back. Peter Robbins on abduction. I mean, just really cool stuff. So go to ufocongress.com to register. You got to make it to this conference. I mean, you probably heard from people who went last year. They had a lot of fun. And the location, like I've told you over and over again, is just beautiful. This place is awesome. So check that out. So that's what's going on, the UFO Congress. So check it out. The other thing that's going on every day on OpenMinds.tv is UFO news. And the guy in the middle of the UFO news is this cool cat named Jason McClellan. And guess what? We have him here with us today. Jason, would you like to tell the dudes about some UFO news?
Yes, sir. Greetings,
All right.
Alejandro, and hello, everyone. This is your Open Minds UFO news brief for Monday, December 12th, 2011. Footage recorded by NASA's Stereo spacecraft on December 1st shows Mercury being hit by a wave of electrical charged material emitted from the sun, known as a coronal mass ejection, or CME. And if you haven't seen the video, it's as cool as it sounds. But what has people talking about the video is a strange object near Mercury that is revealed by the CME blast. Some believe the CME blast revealed a cloaked UFO near the planet. But to get an official answer, MSNBC contacted scientists in the solar physics branch at the United States Naval Research Laboratory, the NRL, who are responsible for analyzing data from the telescope camera that shot the December 1st footage. MSNBC reports that, according to Russ Howard, head scientist of the NRL group, and Nathan Rich, lead ground systems engineer, quote, "It is simply an artifact left over from the way raw H1 telescope data gets processed." The image processing is explained more in detail by MSNBC, and we have that detail on OpenMinds.tv in the news story we have about this. So you can read more about the details involved in it. But Nathan Rich basically explained that, quote, "When this averaging process is done between the previous day and the current day, there is a feature like a planet. This introduces dark negative artifacts in the background, where a planet was the previous day, which then shows up as bright areas in the enhanced image." According to Gizmodo, this particular video shows a 24-hour period captured on December 1st and consists of 36 frames in total. The strange object was also recorded by Stereo's twin satellite, HI-2. NASA and other scientists have used ghost images and image glitches to explain mysterious objects in space videos before, and that could certainly be the case with this video, but it's interesting. It's 24 hours. So the planet was probably there the previous day, as they stated, so it captures two images, but this other image that was captured when this blast goes by seems to be smaller, seems to have a sort of a defined shape, and some people, and I kind of agree, argue that it sort of looks like a Klingon bird of prey.
Oh,
from
wow.
Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of cool. So they think it's a cloaked Klingon bird of prey.
I couldn't make much out personally, so I don't know.
There's not a whole lot.
Yeah.
It's your mind going wild, and you start seeing what you want to see. You go, oh, I see it. Yeah, I can see it because I read somebody else say that they saw it. So, But it doesn't look like a planet, but it certainly could be. It's just, if it's what they say it is, it's just remnants of where a planet was. So light remains from a planet. It's not probably going to hold that sphere shape.
I can't help it. You're the one who brought up the Klingons.
Yes.
I thought the Klingons were on Uranus. I couldn't help it.
Okay, I'll give you that. That was fun. Well,
I think that comes from The Simpsons, actually.
I think it does. But while we're on the topic of Hollywood, let's talk about an article. You wrote this, Alejandro. Steven Spielberg recently revealed that his popular family-friendly alien film, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, was originally going to be an alien attack movie, telling the alleged horrific experience of a family in rural Kentucky supposedly harassed by aliens. Spielberg told Entertainment Weekly, quote, "It was going to be called Night Skies, based on a piece of UFO mythology, where a farm family reported little spindly gray aliens attacking their farm, even riding cows in the farmyard. This farm family basically huddled together for survival. It's a story that's well known in the world of ufology, and we based our script on that story." Spielberg says that the script was changed because he was able to talk Harrison Ford's girlfriend at the time, Melissa Matheson, into rewriting the screenplay, and that resulted in the development of the lovable character E.T. we all know today. The description of the not-so-lovable creatures that allegedly attacked the family in Kentucky resemble that of the mischievous little green man in the movie Gremlins, a movie also produced by Steven Spielberg. So, Alejandro, tell us a little more about this case in Kentucky.
Yeah, I wish I would have known when I wrote the piece on Spielberg for our magazine, because I didn't know this.
Right.
And I should have thought of it, because when you take the pictures that the witnesses had, or actually the Air Force drew from the witness accounts, and you put it next to a gremlin, they're exactly the same. And on OpenMinds.tv and also on UFODailyNews.com, we posted it with the picture so you can see that.
And it's really the only time that I know that I've seen another creature look like that. And you're right, It's just like gremlins with the crazy ears going up.
The big ears, the little waist, the tiny little waist, but the bigger shoulders and the long arms with the claws. So they look exactly alike, and I never put the two together. And this was the case. It is a very famous case amongst ufologists, because little green men, we've talked about this before because I wrote a story a few months ago. Little green men comes from this case in Hopkinsville. But it's interesting, that Spielberg didn't write this story for the gremlins. It's something that he got from someone else, apparently. But obviously when they went to character design, he was heavily influenced by that. And obviously, as he says, he was influenced by that on E.T. Plus the story, even if they have an author bring them a story, they morph the story. And the story, these guys are mischievous little goofballs, which is exactly the Kentucky story. They didn't hurt anybody. Well, they were more dangerous in gremlins. They didn't hurt anybody in the story in Kentucky in 1955, but they ran around and jumped around, and they were playing with these guys and being real crazy, touching, one guy's hair. So it's an interesting story. It's fairly credible. It's one of the only, if not the only, Blue Book case that has actual aliens, extraterrestrials in it. So it was important historically. And here again, it's evidence that Spielberg, another demonstration of how into this stuff he really is. So pretty cool.
Very cool. In other news, an Open Minds affiliate was recently told a story about a woman who witnessed a UFO crash in 1947. The investigator followed up on the story by tracking down and interviewing the witness, but after the interview, it was determined that the UFO encounter involved a landing rather than a crash. Josie Estrada, now 78 years old, lives in San Antonio, New Mexico. Her UFO encounter occurred in 1947 when she was 14 years old. It was a hot July afternoon, and Estrada had been out herding goats on the mesa. At approximately 2 p.m., she saw something very bright and shiny out of the corner of her eye. When she turned toward the object, she saw the sun reflecting off something disc-shaped. She described the object as being so shiny that it resembled a mirror. Estrada said the UFO descended straight down from the sky until it landed approximately 1/4 mile away from her position. To her, the object appeared to be the size of a house, or perhaps slightly a little smaller. She was fascinated and curious, so she excitedly rode her horse at a gallop toward the object. When she approached the bright object, it violently ascended, then shot straight up and disappeared. Other UFOs, of course, were reported in New Mexico in 1947, including the famous Roswell crashes.
Yeah, interesting.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is someone who just emailed you or something?
This is somebody that there were some people doing an investigation in New Mexico, and they heard a story about this woman.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where they heard that it was a UFO crash that had happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, to find out more information, they tracked this woman down and actually went and spoke with her about her encounter.
Cool. Mm-hmm.
So, actual UFO landing, and again, 1947.
Yeah, interesting.
Kind of cool. Well, this was a big story today. Hundreds of pro-democracy protesters in Moscow reportedly witnessed a UFO in the sky above them on Saturday. According to the Telegraph, the silent object was clearly not a helicopter and was described as having pulsating colored lights and had, quote, 5 extended tendrils or pylons emanating from the body of the vehicle. The crowd of people protesting against recent election results allegedly climbed trees to better observe the UFO that seemed to be observing the 25,000 protesters. And there's a video of this. We have it on OpenMinds.tv. And to me, I have to say it does look like some sort of either police drone, which are commonly used now. A lot of police departments around the world use these things. And again, as we've talked about a lot, there are a lot of remote-controlled toys now that people are using that light up and things. So could be either one of those. It doesn't look very mysterious. It looks more like one of those things because we see those a lot now.
It's kind of cool. The reason I don't think it's a toy is because it would be kind of dumb. I mean, this crowd is huge. Thousands of people.
25,000 people. That's
so
a
to
mob.
be flying a toy over a mob of 25,000 people, I mean, these are angry people who are mad at Putin because they think he cheated on the elections.
Mm.
So I don't think, but it would make total sense that, in order to get a scope of how big this crowd is, the police would send a drone over. And, on your story, it's funny, separately, Jason wrote a story, and so did I for UFO Daily News, but we had similar thoughts because we put up pictures of drones. And in one of the drones I had, it has a circle very similar to what they see. The difference is it doesn't have a long fuselage. I think the video is really cool, though. Even if it's a drone, that stuff's kind of cool, too, to see one flying around up there because it's got blinking lights. Mm-hmm. It's hovering and flying around up there. And it looks more sophisticated than just your standard remote control, especially in Russia where they really aren't like out here, They still struggle economically and stuff. They have been for a while, where we've got all kinds of wonderful toys, but we still complain about everything. But
and, this object does appear to be, over the crowd observing, mm-hmm. and that's precisely what police use these drones for.
Yeah.
So
I think that would be the only way. I can just think as a police officer, how would you understand where all the people are in the scope of this crowd without something like that? So,
right.
It'd be vital for them. And now they have the technology. So I tried to look up drones in Russia, and I couldn't find anything, just what we found. The UK has a lot, the smaller ones, like the pictures we posted. But the ones in America, by the American police, those are more like elaborate remote control helicopters.
Yeah.
But they look a lot more elaborate and expensive.
Yeah, they're like
remote
control helicopters, and they're also a smaller scale of like the military drones that are like small jets.
Exactly. I mean, they're cool. They're big and elaborate, and they're really cool.
Yep. Well, in other news, I have statistic here.
Mm.
This is kind of fun. A third of New Zealanders believe aliens have visited Earth. A third.
Yeah.
Not just UFOs. They don't just believe in UFOs. They believe aliens have visited Earth. Perhaps even more surprising, at least to me, is that the number of believers is greater, or actually greatest, among the 30 to 44-year-olds at 36%.
Wow.
Only 26% of those age 60 and older believe we've been visited.
People are most intelligent between those years, too. 33 and, 40 years old?
30 and 44.
Yeah. That's your peak of intelligence.
You're only saying that because you fall into that category.
Well, that's how I know from experience.
And so I will talk to you when you're 60, and I think you will change your view to the 60 and older category.
Probably either that or I'll be like, what? What's your name?
I think that's right. Well, Alejandro, that is all for the news today. Remember, you can check out all of these stories and so many more at openminds.tv, your source for UFO-related news. And if you have a comment about any of these stories or you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email me at jason@openminds.tv. You can contact me on Facebook, Jason Open Minds, and I'm also on Twitter at Acentric. That's ACECENTRIC. That is it for the news. I am Jason McClellan, your Open Minds news correspondent, and you've just been briefed.
All right. Alejandro. Thanks, J-Lo.
J-Lo?
That's kind of cool, Jason.
That is not cool at all.
Like
I'm offended.
Right.
J-Lo is Jennifer Lopez. That's already been taken.
Yeah. But you're short. And you're Jason. J-Lo.
We'll talk later.
All right. Thank you, Jason. As usual, that was a great news brief. Late-breaking news. Whitley Strieber just now texted that Roger Lear is in the hospital and having difficulty breathing, and he says to please pray for him. So we all ask you the same. So Roger Lear, is a good friend of ours. We see him at all the conferences and talk with him and hang out. And, he's a good friend of ours. He's been here quite a bit, and he's a really neat guy. And, of course, if you're unaware, this is the guy who is the foot surgeon who has extracted or arranged to have extracted alien implants. And so he's kind of the forerunner in that field. And so I'm sure you've heard his interviews or seen him. So unfortunately, he's in the hospital right now. So everybody thinks some good thoughts for him. So hopefully he'll get out soon. Also, the disclosure petition. Don't forget the disclosure petition. You can read more about that at disclosurepetition.com. And this is, of course, the petition that has been put forward by Bryce Zabel and Richard Dolan. And really, I guess the whole point is a lot of people, of course, are skeptical that really Washington's going to say anything different than they've already said with the last petition. However, this one is more oriented to UFOs in general, or UAPs. And actually, I'm going to talk about that with Mack, what he thinks of the UFO versus UAP thing. UAP is unidentified aerial phenomena, and some people feel that sounds more professional than UFO because UFO has a lot of baggage. My argument is if you tell someone about UAPs, what are they going to say? What are you talking about? And you're going to have to say UFOs, and so you don't really win that way. I think we have to change, and we are changing what people think about UFOs in general. I don't think everybody these days thinks about UFOs as just totally being silly. I think that paradigm is changing, which is wonderful. And even though that's harder work, I think that's great. But anyway, that's what the disclosure petition that Bryce and Richard is focused on. So you can go to disclosurepetition.com and read some information about it and go there and sign it. He's already got well over 1,000. I think we're pushing 2,000, maybe even more. We need 25,000 by December 30th. So go get your family and your friends and sign this thing. Also, Lee Spiegel of the Huffington Post has written about it lately, and he actually got a lot of great quotes from people, and you can see that. If you keep up to speed on all of our Facebooks and Twitters that we have, what do we got? We've got Open Minds TV on Twitter. We've got UFO Daily News on Twitter. On Facebook, we have UFO Think Tank. We have UFO Daily News. We have Alejandro Rojas. We have Open Minds Maureen and Open Minds Jason. Open Minds Magazine. We're all over the place. So we post all of this stuff, and we've had some updates on all of these stories. And, of course, we follow Lee Spiegel's stories. And he's going to be speaking at our conference. And what's great about Lee Spiegel is he writes some stories where he does lots of interviews, gets lots of really good quotes, and he's pretty much the only real national news. There are some local news writers who do a great job, Steve Hammonds, Billy Cox, but he's the only one that's really writing for a nationally syndicated news that is writing regularly on UFOs. And, of course, I've got my blog up there. Thanks, Lee. But I know that we also have some upcoming stories that will be on the Huffington Post, I'm pretty sure, on this same subject. So keep an eye there. But go ahead and sign that petition if you haven't yet. If all of you listeners went and signed that, we would have enough, and we would get another comment, and hopefully one that's more oriented around the UFO phenomena and possibly at least investigating it, as opposed to them focusing on whether or not we've talked to extraterrestrials a lot or thus far. And we'll talk more about that. I ask every guest, pretty much what they think about the extraterrestrial hypothesis, meaning just because we know there's a UFO phenomena, does that necessarily mean it's extraterrestrial in nature? I'm kind of like Jim Mars. He said it's probably all the above, that and more. It's a very complicated matter. I fit in that arena, but some don't. Some feel that, maybe that's too assumptive. Some feel that maybe we need to focus on the fact that there's more to this than just that. So there are a lot of interesting and intelligent thoughts when it comes to this. Also, you may have heard, and I might as well just say, and just so I could get it on the record, that Michael Horn, who we've had on the show before, talking about Billy Meyer, one of the reasons I wanted to get him on the show is because, we have had some doubts about the Billy Meyer case, myself and some of the other people who have written pieces here at Open Minds. And like he says, we have the Wendell Stevens archives. And, when I went into this, I thought, wow, this is going to be great, because I wanted to meet. And, well, you guys listen to my show. I wanted to meet for the Billy Meyer thing to come out and say, hey, we found some great stuff in the archives to really substantiate the whole Billy Meyer story. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and instead just the opposite happened, and we found more that was kind of dubious and made us doubt. I mean, I wanted to believe the Billy Meyer thing, and I'm just skeptical because if you listen to the show, so many of the kind of convoluted things that don't make sense regarding this. Well, Michael Horn's a little upset with me because I'm kind of not jumping on the bandwagon, but I'll promise you, and Michael Horn and everybody else, if Michael Horn really comes up with some great evidence that demonstrates that something is happening, I will more than happy be to write about it and to talk to you guys about it. But thus far, that hasn't happened. All the emails I get from Michael Horn fit in the same argument I had when he was on the show, which is that it's a link to a site that says Billy Meyer said this, and then this is what really happened, and so he predicted this. But that's not enough. I could do that all day. I can say Jason predicted that, you know, a UFO is going to fly over Russians and put off and all of this, or putting in all of this stuff, and then, but if I don't have any proof to document that he did that, then we don't go anywhere. So, and I just don't feel that if he has it, he hasn't demonstrated that well enough. And I wish him all the best. I hope he can demonstrate it because that would be incredible. That would be phenomenal. So that's just so you all know. Of course, if I found some extraordinary data that really debunks the whole thing, I'll also share that because, you know, I want to give you guys the truth and what's going on so you can make up your own minds. But enough said about that, and I probably won't go there for quite some time unless some great stuff comes out. Let's go ahead and get to our interview, though, with Mack Maloney, the author of UFOs in Wartime. He's a great guy. I'm excited to talk to him. I am happy, and I know I say this every time, but that's because it's true, and it's what I'm really feeling. I'm really excited to talk to Mack Maloney today, the author of UFOs in Wartime. Mack, are you there?
Yes, I am.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty good tonight. How are you doing?
Good, not too bad. So it's great. You've been getting some publicity. I was all excited. You know, I've had some authors recently, and one of them hasn't been around as much, and so it's always fun to kind of have someone on the show, and then it's their first time out there and people get to know them. And I kind of was hoping that would be the case, but which is no big deal because it's wonderful to see. You were on Coast to Coast, and you've been doing some interviews. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the publisher was able to connect with Coast to Coast, and that just kind of came out of the blue. I had to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning to do it from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. But other than that, you know, it was a great opportunity. I think every interview I do is an opportunity just to, you know, talk about the book and UFOs in general.
Yeah. Well, it's great you got Coast because they, you know, that always drives a lot of hits. So that's good. Hopefully got some book sales.
I hope so.
So I think you were telling me earlier that this is your first nonfiction, and it's on UFOs.
Right. I'm primarily a fiction writer. I've been writing full-time military fiction for about 20 years or so. We've got about 35 books. Stopped counting a few books ago. But I basically have been doing like Tom Clancy stuff, and I did a post 9/11 series called Super Hawks. I started back in the 80s with a series called Wingman. It was about a Zen fighter pilot, and a few other series along the way, and a couple of them touched on the UFO puzzle, let's say, but didn't really go that deep into them. So when I had this opportunity to write this book, nonfiction book, I jumped at the chance because I've always been interested in UFOs. So it was an opportunity for me to bring the kind of military side of the stuff I do to UFOs. So, you know, hopefully it came out okay.
Yeah. That's great. Was this book at all a bit of a coming out for you? I mean, were there some of your readers that were shocked or surprised by you writing a nonfiction on UFOs?
Well, I don't think that they were shocked. I think maybe surprised. But anyone who has, you know, read my fiction stuff, I don't think they should be surprised about anything because it's, you know, it's kind of Tom Clancy stuff, but it's a little to left field of Tom Clancy's stuff. And you know, like I said, we've dealt with UFOs before. We've dealt with like conspiracy theories and things along that line. So I don't think it really surprised many of my readers that I would go to do a nonfiction book. Everyone I've heard from said that they're into it, so that's good.
That's very good. And I don't know if you feel this way, but it certainly seems, oftentimes because of the ridicule factor that comes along with UFOs, sometimes people don't like to talk about their UFO beliefs. And I think the polls show, even though in the public people aren't talking about it as much, the polls show that a lot of people believe in the phenomenon, or at least think that it's interesting and they'd like to know more. That there are a lot of people out there that are willing to talk about it.
Well, in the publishing world, it's let me say it's considered not fringe, but you do kind of have to be prepared for people looking sideways at you, if you know what I mean, when you bring it up. But on the other hand, in the publishing world, they know that, as you say, there's a lot of people interested in it. There's a lot of people who are interested in it that might not voice their opinions. I know, but from firsthand experience, that there's a lot of airline pilots who are usually retired Air Force pilots, as you know, who are very interested in it, but would never say anything like in their workplace about it. So I think there's a lot of closeted UFO fans out there, and I think through shows like yours and Coast to Coast and things like that, I think that they're getting the information that they would like to get and learn more about it.
Yeah, I think it's great to provide it, and that happens. And I always think it's great of people like you, and I love to hear the stories, because it does take some courage to go to those arenas. And I like to hear when people like you go to publishers or to places where you are looked at sideways and brave enough to say, hey, this is what I want to do, because I think it helps loosen up those environments out there that still have that, looking at you sideways kind of connotation attached to this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my case, I've been doing it for a long time, and publishing or being a published writer, it's a hard business to stay in. It changes all the time, and people always say, publishing it's really at its worst it's ever been. I've heard that for 20 years. They're into making money, frankly, and they'll publish something that they think will make money. But on the other hand, when you go approach them with a project like this, what you're doing is that not only will you, the writer, be involved, this is going to take 2 years of your life, but it's also going to take a certain amount of time on the of an editor, of an editor's assistant, of the publisher itself, the printer, the copy editor. So you're involving a lot of people when you sign a book contract. Your agent is another one, and so I thought the idea would be, well, let's just make this so it's informative, and it's really just, it's not a long text or a thesis on UFOs. It's a collection of 70 episodes put in chronological order, having to do with military encounters with UFOs. And I just thought, well, this is the way that we'll do it, where at the very least it will be entertaining. And maybe if some people out there who don't believe in UFOs read it, I think by the end of the book, I think we make a good case that UFOs exist and something's going on. So at least it will attract the interest of everyone who is going to be involved in it. So that's kind of how I looked at the project. And, I had a little bit of a track record. So you combine those two things, and I really didn't run into too much, looking sideways at me. A little bit, but not much.
Oh, that's good. What I think other people also find exciting, or at least they don't expect, which is, something you certainly touch on in this book, are the very credible accounts and the credible people that have had experiences. And you're certainly talking to a lot, because, people hold, for the most part, military people or retired military pretty highly. And there are a lot of these guys that have sightings or know of sightings or have buddies who have sightings. Mm-hmm. I think for me that was interesting when I started getting involved with this, how much military personnel have had stories
Mm-hmm. Well, we found a lot of them, and it kind of goes to the idea that, what we're trying to say in the book is that, during times of war or when we're preparing to go to war, that UFO sightings spike. So it would just be natural that a lot of military people would be the people observing these things, and that's certainly the case. And once again, it says something about the military of the United States, that the military structure has definitely been involved in some kind of a cover-up of UFOs, whether they know what they are and they're covering that up, or they don't know what they are and they're covering that up. But it's something about the American military person that when someone tells them, don't say anything about this ever again, which is usually what someone is told if they report a UFO sighting while they're a member of the military. And, a lot of people stick to that oath. Mm-hmm. A lot of people go to the grave not telling what happened, and it says something good about, the American military person. But as people like us who are trying to get to the bottom of this, I mean, more people, a lot of more people more than me, but, it's kind of a hindrance too. But so, there's a certain amount of courage on the part of people who, usually retired military people who have seen something to come forward and tell people like us what they saw. But every time they do, it just moves us that much further down the road to figuring out what this thing is.
Right. And I want to get more into that. And I all of your comments just inspire more questions. But before I forget, I do want to kind of get to the beginning as to what piqued your interest in the UFO phenomenon.
Well, when I was a kid growing up in Boston, I would go to the library all the time, and I would just look for every UFO book that I could find. And I read them over and over. There was only a certain number of them in this little library we went to. So I wound up reading them over and over again. And I was a fan of science fiction, too. And I grew up in the 50s, and there was a lot of kind of sci-fi, UFO stuff going on. So it always attracted my interest. But I've never seen one. I always wanted to see one, but I never saw one. But what really convinced me that something was going on was I have an older brother who was in the Air Force for 25 years. And when he first joined the Air Force, he was only in the Air Force probably about a year and a half or so. He was a jet engine mechanic, and he was assigned to an air base down in South Carolina. And he told me this story. He was out on the flight line at night. They were fixing an airplane in the middle of the night only because it got so hot down there during the day that it was more comfortable for them to do it at night. And he was out there with 3 or 4 other people, isolated part of the flight line, and this UFO came out of the sky, came right down on top of them, and it startled them so much they actually dove underneath the airplane for cover.
Wow.
He looked up at this thing. He says it was a flying saucer. It was saucer shaped. It had lights. It was bright. It stayed hovering over the airplane for a few minutes, and then it took off. And then he said he made the supreme mistake of telling higher authority about this. And so what they did was they isolated he and the 4 people who were with him, put them in separate rooms, and for the next 4 days, didn't interrogate them, but basically what they did was they had them tell their story over and over and over again, night and day, over and over again for 4 or 5 days. And my brother said at the end of the 4th day, he just wanted to get out of there. So what they had them do, what the Air Force had them do was sign, let's say, an affidavit or a statement saying that what they actually saw was a reentry vehicle from something that had been shot off from Cape Canaveral. And he says he signed it. They all signed it because they just wanted this to end.
Wow.
And he did, and he said he really regretted ever telling anybody about it. And that's the atmosphere that you have in the military, that we find that all throughout the stories we have in the book, is that if you say anything about it, you're going to be ridiculed, or you're going to be questioned and let's say just bored to the point of saying, that isn't really what I saw. Now, the unusual thing about my brother's career is that towards the end of his career, certainly later when he was further into his career at the Air Force, he was sent to Area 51 a couple times to work on Air Force planes that had broken down out there. So he's actually been there, and he told me a few stories about, not UFO related or anything, but just what a strange place that is. One of them is that when he got off the plane, there was a sign there that said, "Remember, you were never here." And another weird thing he told me is that for some reason, there's lawns in front of a lot of the buildings out there. And as you know, it's out in the middle of the desert.
Right.
And it just struck him as odd that there would be lawns out there and there were people with lawnmowers and trimming them and watering them. And, he just thought that was very odd, too.
That is very strange. Yeah, and I'm sure you ran into this more dealing with the military, the whole idea of it's just too much of a headache. A funny story of mine was this guy who worked the DEW line way back, during beginning of the Cold War and out on a ship way out there near Russia. And they had gotten a new radar system, and this radar system kept catching things that were strange. He was a radar tech. And so they would call him up and say, hey, Carter, what's wrong with the radar? He would check it out, and they would say nothing. And they ended up starting to call him Carter's contacts because they kept screwing up. They called, and they had the guys come look at it, and they kept looking at it. It was all this harassment and everything. And finally, they just toned the thing down so it didn't get as far. But Franklin wondered why the other radar boats weren't talking about this. And he asked later on a couple people, and he got the same answer. Are you kidding? We weren't going to report that. We were getting that weird stuff, but we weren't going to say anything. We didn't want any trouble. And you get this over and again. We don't want any trouble, so we're not reporting it.
Right. It's, the unusual thing, too, is that that's how it is in the U.S. military, and there's a number of reasons for that, and including the fact that in the beginning of the 50s, the CIA actually started a campaign to make it seem like it would people would be ridiculed if they reported UFOs. But in Russia, and I'm sure you probably know this, in Russia back in the 70s, I think, they were so interested in UFOs, this is when Russia was still the Soviet Union, that they told all their military people, pilots, soldiers, sailors, whatever, if you ever see a UFO, fill out a report and send it in to us. So they basically had this huge army, huge armed forces, millions of eyes looking in the sky, reporting UFOs. It's the exact opposite of, the stance that we took. Now, what they saw, what they found out, who knows, and maybe some of that stuff came out when, the wall came down. I don't know. I get a feeling a lot of it didn't, but there's just a complete opposite of the way that we look at it, and they're encouraging their soldiers to see them. We're discouraging our soldiers from seeing them.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, and you might have found this, and maybe you can speak to this, kind of the evolution of our military. It quickly changed early on, but you see in the late 40s and 50s that there really was these heated debates inside of the military going on about what do we do about this whole UFO thing before ridicule really kicked in and it all shut down. But it was interesting back then because I think there was some debate. Do we do like the Russians? Do we have them send them out there and say, hey, tell us what's going on and, tell the public what we're experiencing, or do we shut it up? And unfortunately, they chose to shut it up.
Well, they chose to shut it up, right? And it, you have to ask the question why. Why? There was a point in 1947 where the Air Force went to their ATIC section, which was made up of scientists, Air Technical Intelligence Center, and they said look into UFOs, and they were called flying saucers at the time, and 6 months later, they came back with, their report was, we think these things are real, and the Pentagon basically said to them, that's not what we want to hear. Go and change your report, and they did, and they came back, 6 months later. I'm shortening the story, but they came back and said, well, most UFO sightings are either hoaxes or hallucinations or whatever. That was the time right then that the Air Force could have done a serious study on UFOs, and they didn't. Instead of opening up, as you say, and really looking into it, they chose to cover it up, and and we're still suffering for it, 60 years later.
Yeah. And did you find in the military witnesses that you've talked to, not only, of course, do we all suffer because we don't have the information, but in particular, a lot of these poor guys suffer?
Yeah, if they say anything, they do. In World War II, even in both American pilots and British pilots, what they found out very quickly in regards to the Foo Fighters, they were running into these unidentified flying objects over Europe and during the Pacific War as well. But over Europe, these Foo Fighters would trail them during bombing runs and show up and fly in formation with them. And some of them were glowing orbs, and some of them were craft, cigar-shaped craft, saucer-shaped craft, and so on. And what they found out very quickly is that when they returned from their bombing mission and were debriefed by their intelligence officers, that the intelligence officers would take the information about Foo Fighters, but basically they were saying, look, we're here to win the war, we're here to bomb Germany, whatever these things are, we don't have time or the wherewithal to figure out what they are. So, if you're going to report them, sure, but what they found out was they were basically told silently, don't report these things. And those people that did were ridiculed, as you were just, pointing out. So, you know how the service is a very closed society. You don't want to be ridiculed about anything, never mind, for reporting some Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers thing that was going on. So it really suppressed a lot of sightings that if we knew more about them, we might be that much closer to figuring out what this thing is.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about starting chronologically, but maybe since you started up talking about the Foo Fighters, it would be a good point to jump in because that's really the most well-known UFO wartime phenomena, the Foo Fighters.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to give a tip of my hat to another author named Keith Chester. He wrote a book called Strange Company, which is the definitive book on Foo Fighters. And anyone who wants to know everything there was to know about Foo Fighters, they should pick that up. And he and I became friends over the phone and through email, and he helped me a lot as far as, where to research and how to do a book like this. But basically what happened was early in World War II, we'll start with World War II in Europe, when the British started the bombing campaign against Germany. Very early in it, bomber crews were coming back and reporting that, either going to the target while over the target or returning from the target, these strange glowing lights or they called them unguided rockets at some point, or these aerial craft would tail them. They would either trail behind them. Sometimes they would fly in formation off one of their wings. Sometimes they'd fly in front of them. They would stay with the airplanes from anywhere from a minute to almost an hour. They would maneuver around them, and then invariably they would take off in such a high burst of speed they'd be gone in the blink of an eye. And these reports started kind of filtering in. The British didn't really know what to do about them, so once again this kind of ridicule factor came in, and these reports, they feel that a lot of them, the intelligence officers might have taken them, but they probably didn't go very high up the command chain. So then in 1942, when the American Air Force started arriving, end of 42, beginning of 43, started arriving in force in England, Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force, it was called at the time, used to bomb during the day, and the British would bomb at night. And suddenly American crews started seeing all these weird things too. And there was the same situation where the intelligence officers were faced with this problem with, well, look, we want to get all the details we can about how to beat Germany, but, this crazy, as I say, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon stuff, because those things were very popular at the time, they just didn't know what to do with it. So for the most part, they suppressed it. There were situations where photos were taken and they were examined. There's a story that came out just a little while ago that Winston Churchill was actually shown a very detailed secret photo of a Foo Fighter that had been trailing a British reconnaissance plane, and he banned it from being released for 50 years because he thought it was from outer space, and he thought if there were people here from outer space or beings, that our society would collapse. Anyway, people saw these things all throughout the war. British pilots, American pilots. As it turned out, German pilots saw them too. In the Pacific, there's a lot of reports of the same thing. These weird craft trailing our bombers on these long bombing runs that they would do over the Pacific. And probably maybe about 10% or even less were actually reported and recorded. I think Keith Chester figures that, the vast majority of them went unreported, and, that's a shame, but that's just the situation. And the strange thing is when the war was over, I mean, for a lot of the British especially, they were just convinced these were German super weapons. And at the end of the war, we would find out what they were. But and there's a lot of books around these days, frankly, where that they make their case that these things were Nazi super weapons and they might still be around and so on. But we go into detail in the book saying that it's impossible for them to have been Nazi weapons because, number one, there was no recorded instances of any of these Foo Fighters firing on our bombers. So if they were Nazi weapons, why wouldn't they fire on us? Why wouldn't they fire on our troops? Number two, by midway through the war in 1943 or so, the Nazis were running out of all kinds of materials, steel, rubber, ball bearings, oil, so on and so forth. In 1944, even though they had jet fighters, the Me-262, the cockpits were made out of wood because they didn't have the steel to make the cockpits. So how could the Nazis have had these fantastic flying machines when they were building their jet fighters cockpits out of wood? And where was the support structure for these kinds of machines? Where's the scientists? Where's the fuel? Where's the vast underground facility making these things? And the biggest question of all is, if they had some aerial machines that could fly 10,000 miles an hour, do all these incredible things, why did they lose the war? So they couldn't have been Nazi super weapons. They were something else.
Right. Yeah, that I was going to ask you about that, so I'm glad you went there, because I know there was one report, and I can't remember who it was, where he, soon after the war, speculated that these were probably probes that were these little orbs from the Germans. But like you said, there wasn't evidence of this technology, nor did we find these things. And if they could do that back then, of course, we did try to retrieve all the technology we could from the Germans. Mm-hmm. And that hasn't been created.
Right. And how it went after the war was, half the German scientists went to the Russians and half the German scientists came to the United States. And basically, von Braun and his men put NASA on the moon. I mean, it was the German scientists, their knowledge of rockets, liquid-fueled rockets, that put us on the moon. So if these had been German super weapons, those guys would have to have been involved in it. So why didn't they just turn over all these secrets to NASA? And why would we be bothering putting huge, basically bombs inside of rockets to get into orbit when this crazily high technology was around? It just doesn't make sense that they were Nazi super weapons. Plus, they saw them in the Pacific too.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Foo Fighter incident, a lot of people talk about modern ufology starting with the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 47. However, I kind of really feel that it all got started and this slow momentum began to build due to the Foo Fighters, because I don't know if you found this, but you probably did that. There were a lot of well-respected military people. I mean, these were our heroes after World War II. These guys won the war, saved the world. They saved the planet. Mm-hmm. And when they came out and they started saying, we saw UFOs when we were back there and when we were fighting, and even now flying around in the United States, people took their words. And even when the Air Force tried to debunk them, I mean, people are like, look, Air Force officials, you're trying to tell us this war hero is not telling the truth. I'm sorry, we believe him more.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was definitely a campaign that the Air Force, went ahead with full force, and that was to cover up the situation, and then to make anyone who reported the UFO, whether they were civilians or military, make them the object of ridicule. And the Air Force had several projects. Blue Book, Grudge were a couple of the names. And these things weren't filled with scientists, in lab coats looking into UFOs. They were just basically military officers who were trying their best to debunk every UFO report that would come in. And I think it was Dr. J. Allen Hynek who said that during, when the military was investigating UFOs, none of them got the quote-unquote FBI treatment, meaning, none of them got the CSI treatment. Basically what they were doing was they would take a UFO sighting that they knew was Venus or seagulls or something like that, and that's what they would investigate. So they would, at the end of their investigation, they would say, see, it was just Venus. See, it was just a flock of seagulls. And the ones that they couldn't explain are the ones that they didn't investigate. And that's how the Air Force basically was able to cover this up and put it in people's heads that if you saw a UFO, you always had to be aware that people were going to say that you were crazy. And that's the atmosphere they created at the end of the 40s, and it's the atmosphere that's still around today. And it's even more so for, as you say, for the military pilots, high military officers, airline pilots. they don't dare say anything about this stuff, not in this country, because you'll just be ridiculed.
Now, you get into, then after the Foo Fighter incident, Foo Fighters, and maybe I'll have you speak to this because this is kind of interesting. It seems like, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you know better, the Foo Fighter phenomena curbed. That then things changed and people started seeing saucers and things like that. But it seemed like after World War II it curbed. Is that the case?
Yep. When World War II was over, the Foo Fighters went away. And just the fact that they went away once we stopped, making war on each other, to me, is just more evidence that, we try to get across in the book is that during war, or preparing for war, UFOs sightings go way up, and it's because it's as if they're watching us, watching what we do. But once the war was over, no more Foo Fighters, or no more what we came to know as Foo Fighters.
Right. And I mean, there were still military sightings, but they seem to be different. Right.
I mean, they in 1947, when Kenneth Arnold, had his sighting, the summer of 47, and he saw 9 objects flying over Mount Rainier. He was a businessman, I'm sure everyone knows, and he was flying in his private plane. He landed after he made the sighting, and eventually the press talked to him, and his quote was, they look like saucers, going across the top of a lake, and the press took that and twisted it into flying saucers, and that's how we got the term flying saucers. What's interesting is as soon as that story hit the newspapers, people started seeing quote-unquote flying saucers everywhere around the country. That whole summer, including the Roswell incident, happened during that summer. The Maury Island incident happened right around that same time. We list in the book what happened in the 1 week following Kenneth Arnold's sightings, and there were hundreds of sightings made of flying saucers, not cigar-shaped, not Foo Fighter-looking flying saucers. So as soon as that term got out there, all of a sudden people were seeing them everywhere. And you're right, between the flying saucer shape and the cigar-shaped object, those two descriptions are what people see the most. And a lot of that started after 1947.
And then after that, you go into sightings that are a little less known. We've tried to cover sightings at least, not so much during the Korean War because I don't know of a whole bunch, but during Vietnam. But there were UFO sightings you go into during those wars as well.
The Korean War was interesting. Actually, the Korean War has a lot to do with the investigation of UFOs. And once again, I have to tip my hat to another UFO writer named Dr. Richard Haynes, who's written a book on, it's called Aerial Vehicles Spotted Over Korea. And he really, just as Keith Chester wrote the book on Foo Fighters, he wrote the book on UFOs over Korea. And this is why Korea is important. The Air Force shut down its Project Grudge right before Korea started, saying that if any UFOs are either hoaxes or they're delusions or they're hallucinations, things of that nature. And then all of a sudden, Korea starts, and now you have the situation where you have lots of jet fighter pilots flying around in jets that not only are armed, but they also have radars in them. And we have a lot of radars on the ground. We have a lot of radars on ships. So, and Korea is a relatively small country. It's about 1/3 the size of Texas. And so you have these crowded skies, and people started seeing UFOs. We have a drawing in the book of an incident where these enormous UFOs showed up. These 3 Navy fighter bombers saw them. And now, and a lot of ships offshore saw them. There was just a lot of UFO sightings in Korea. And what happened was the Air Force, because they were primarily the ones investigating UFOs, or supposed to be, were in a position of saying, well, we've just said that anyone who reports UFO is either a hoaxer or they're delusional or they're a religious fanatic, yet our pilots are now reporting them. So we can't call them all those things because these are the guys we're counting on to win this war. So they would come up with all these outlandish explanations. Like there's one where a B-29 full of World War II veterans is on a bombing mission up to North Korea, and this thing comes up and rides alongside them for 5 minutes, a very bright shining object, and then it takes off at high speed. And when these guys reported it, the Air Force came up with the explanation that it was an enemy flare. Another huge object is seen over North Korea later on in the war, clocked at 800 miles an hour. Well, the Air Force said that must have been an enemy weather balloon. Mm-hmm. So they would come up with all these crazy explanations. But behind the scenes, we're pretty sure what happened was, and Dr. Richard Haynes agreed, is what happened was our pilots were seeing so many of these things, the Air Force said, we better reopen an investigation into UFOs, and that's how Project Blue Book came about. And that lasted almost 10 years, and relatively speaking, was probably the most successful Air Force investigation into UFOs, even though it wasn't really, that serious. They did some good work, but for the most part, didn't. But that's why Korea is important. If things didn't happen as they did in Korea, maybe they would not have got back into the business of investigating UFOs at all.
Yeah. And it goes to, which is interesting, is, that's why I appreciate your book, and I think this stuff is so important. And, you referred to earlier about, the different Air Force studies, and I know you're referring to Ruppelt's work, who was working on Blue Book, how important all of this military stuff was to the UFO phenomena back then, because they were experiencing this and figuring out how to deal with it. And this is a perfect example, Korea. And now their guys who, like you said, they've got it back, are starting to experience these things. So what do we do? Mm-hmm. And it's always been a struggle for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And like I say, they were put in this position of saying, if we go with our official line, then we're saying all these pilots, our pilots, many of them were trained combat pilots, veterans from World War II. We got to say that they're cranks, that they're hoaxes, that they're delusional. Mm-hmm. They had really backed themselves into a corner, and they couldn't get out of it, and so they just started making up all these excuses. But once again, behind the scenes, they knew we have to get back into this.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move on to Vietnam, because Vietnam, the difference, I guess, here would be that the Condon report had happened. So at this point now, Blue Book has been closed. They've had their report from CU, the University of Colorado, where they've said, there's no scientific evidence here. We got to close this stuff down. And they close it all down. But then you get into Vietnam, and you have accounts there also.
Right. The stories that we got into in Vietnam that we looked into are very strange, and they're unlike any other of the stories in the book. And I think it's because of the nature of the war itself. It wasn't a conventional war. It wasn't. There was no front lines. It was basically a war where we went in with massive force, and it was a helicopter war. We put our soldiers in helicopters, land in enemy territory, and try to kill more of them than they killed of us, because it was a body count, which was going to determine the score of who won this war. Of course, it didn't go that way, but that's the strategy they tried to use. Plus, you were only there for a year. You could go if you could make it those 365 days, then you were out. You were free. There was not that morale. There were bad morale problems. There was not that esprit de corps that people had in World War II. And there was frankly a lot of drug use. So if you combine all those things together into this kind of a negative aspect of the war, every war is negative, but this is particularly negative. It just seems like that's a strange situation to put people in. So the reports that we get from Vietnam are very strange, and I'll give you a few examples. There's one story in the book about this gentleman who was on a helicopter. He's a crew member of a helicopter. They went on one of these armed assaults where they land a lot of helicopters on an LZ and go and try to engage the enemy. And his helicopter landed in the landing zone was high grass, and between the heat of the day, the heat of the helicopters, and the fact that the communist troops were shooting at them, a grass fire broke out. So they're landing basically in the middle of a grass fire, and the helicopter behind them caught on fire. So his crew chief told him, go back and help these guys. He has a fire extinguisher, and go back and help him. He's unarmed. He runs back to the helicopter. By the time he gets there, they've solved their problem, and they're taking off. So now he's out in the middle of this field. He's disoriented. He has no weapon. He's in the middle of a firefight and the middle of a grass fire. So in the middle of all that, a communist soldier appears and is about to shoot him. And before that can happen, the communist soldier himself is shot by something. And the American turns around, and what he swears he saw was this 8-foot giant, in a uniform, but not an American uniform, had a helmet on, had some kind of a weapon. He had killed this communist soldier, and the American just, took that opportunity to find his helicopter, jump back on it, and get out of there. And as they were flying off, he could see the dead communist soldier, but no sign of this giant. It's a very strange story, but we had to put it in there because it really kind of gives you the flavor of these stories that we got from the Vietnam War. Another one, real quick, was had to do with there was a lot of CIA activity in Vietnam. So there's this one story where the CIA hit team had infiltrated into North Vietnam. They were on an assassination mission. They carried out the mission. They were coming back to their point where the helicopter was going to take them out. Some communist soldiers got on their trail. There was a running gun battle. They get to this area where there's two hills. The Americans hide on one hill, and the communists go to this other hill, and a firefight starts. Out of the blue comes this object. The communists probably thought it was a helicopter coming and picking up the CIA team, but it turns out to be a flying saucer. They fire on it. The flying saucer fires back at them, and suddenly there's no more communist fire. The flying saucer takes off at tremendous speed, goes out to the ocean. The CIA team waits a little while, then they go over to the next hill, and they find all the communist soldiers, basically evaporated. Very little left of them. Their helicopter comes, picks them up. They go back to their base, and they tell their superiors about their mission, but also what happened with this flying saucer. They are then brought to an interrogation center, given some kind of a drug, almost like an amnesia drug. The person who told this story, for whatever reason, had no effect on him. He could remember what the other members of his team couldn't. He soon got out of the military, or got out of the CIA, moved to Alaska. Years later, he became a fisherman. He was out in his boat with his wife, and the same UFO that he saw over Vietnam that day appeared above his boat. And the way he took it was, this is how I can close this chapter in my life. The UFO stayed there for a little while and then took off. And that's how he looked at it. But once again, it's a very strange story. There's no other stories in the book like anything like that. Just for some reason, the stories that came from Vietnam were just really, really weird.
That is so strange. And it reminds me of, it kind of harkens back to, which we'll get into because they're in your book, the ancient stories and kind of the biblical stories of, the God smiting our enemies and all of these stories of the Middle Ages. So, and it's interesting that Vietnam had that tone.
Right. You're right. We have a couple stories in the book about Alexander the Great in 312 BC. He was, he was in the process of conquering the known world back then, and he had come to this river, strategic river crossing, and his army was made up of many troops, but also cavalry with horses and war elephants. They're about to go across this river when these, as they described it, flying shields appeared and buzzed the army to the point where they scared the animals, and the animals would not go across the river. So there's a case where it seems like the UFOs were trying to interfere with what he was doing. But then a couple of years later, he was laying siege to the city of Tyre, which is off of present-day Lebanon, and was actually a city that was built out in a harbor. And Alexander had surrounded it, and his troops were building a causeway out to it so they could attack it. And just as they completed this causeway, as the story goes, the shield showed up again. One of them fired a bolt of something, knocked down a wall, and allowed Alexander's troops to invade the city and to take it. Yes, that they have like biblical connotations to them. But I have to say that of the 70 or so episodes that we have in the book, only a handful have tell about the UFOs interfering, let's say, directly in what we are doing. The vast majority of them, the stories are just these UFOs, Foo Fighters, whatever you want to call them, depending on the time period, just watching us, observing us as we go to war.
Right, which is, it seems extremely rare in UFO reports with this sort of choosing sides or anything. So it's interesting that we had these during Vietnam. Now, speaking of kind of, it also has ancient connotations because these wars are in the Middle East and Babylonia, and you call it over the Garden of Eden, but the Middle East, and of course our wars there. Now, I have actually had. I've had a few stories from soldiers in Iraq and some UFO sightings, and actually I've read a couple that were similar to this. That the UFOs came and beamed everybody, all the bad guys. Have you had that sort of thing? What sort of sightings did you retrieve from that area?
Well, when we were putting the book together, it just seemed, we started in 1909 with the scare ships flap in England, and we brought it up to right after the end of the first Gulf War. So we are literally spanning the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So we didn't get into the invasion of Iraq, and we did not get into the war in Afghanistan. But in the first Gulf War in 1991, if you remember, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in the summer of 1990. And then there was this 6 months of where we were continually building up our troops, and then the war itself started in January of 1991. Well, during that 6-month buildup or 5 months buildup, there were many, many reports of UFOs, not just over the Persian Gulf, but over the entire Middle East. And once again, is it because there were more eyes looking to the sky? Is it because there were more airplanes flying around because we're in this, getting ready for war situation? But we have stories about sightings in Egypt and Jordan and Israel and over Saudi Arabia and in the Persian Gulf and so on. And then when the war itself started, we have this story about how a UFO came down on 4 ships in the Persian Gulf, a British ship and 3 American ships, and it came so low that they fired on it. And what people say is, in a war you shoot first and ask questions later. They just thought it was some kind of an enemy. Later on in the war, we had another story where 4 F-16s were going on a bombing mission to Baghdad at night, and they are early morning, and they spotted UFO. One of the 4 F-16s peeled off and intercepted it. As the story goes, the UFO shot at the F-16, and the F-16 shot back and shot it down, and it crashed in the Saudi Arabian desert. People were there, saw the wreckage before the American military showed up to get them out of the area, and supposedly they packed it up in crates and flew it back to the United States. And then maybe the most intriguing story that we kept running into, and we saw it so many times that we felt we had to put in the book, was after the first Gulf War and before the invasion of Iraq, there was this kind of undeclared war between Iraq and the United States where there was a no-fly zone over Iraq, and U.S. planes used to patrol over Iraq every day for years. Every once in a while they would fire on one of Saddam Hussein's anti-aircraft batteries, but they were just basically degrading his anti-aircraft system. Well, in the middle of all this, as the story goes, supposedly the Iraqi anti-aircraft people shot down a UFO, and his people recovered it, brought it to what is considered Iraq's Area 51, and supposedly reverse engineered it. From that reverse engineering, made some fantastic weapons. And if you want to believe the people who were reporting this story, that was the WMD that we went in to look for in the invasion of Iraq. Now, and on one hand, maybe it makes a little sense because we didn't find any nuclear weapons. We didn't find any biological weapons. In fact, we knew he probably didn't have those things because the UN was crawling all over Iraq for 10 years looking for those things and never found them. So was the U.S. military looking for a WMD that was reverse engineered from a crashed UFO that Saddam Hussein had recovered? That'd be a pretty wild story. It'd be a pretty history-changing story, but that story is out there, so we felt that we should put it in the book, so we did.
Yeah, very interesting theory. And I guess before we get off the worst night, kind of ask you some wrap-up questions. We'll go back to the beginning, at least, of America and the American Revolution, and you even have some sighting reports from that war.
Well, once again, we after we did all the research and we had to distill the number of stories to put in the book down to a reasonable number, we came upon this story, which again was too good not to put in. And what it was a report that during Valley Forge, at probably the lowest point of the American Revolution, where George Washington and the Continental Army was spending the winter in Valley Forge. They were almost out of food, water, even things to build fires with. They became friendly with an Indian tribe that they called the Greenskins. And these people gave them supplies of food and helped them get through the winter. And it was reported that these people lived in a lodge that was circular, that was sometimes there and sometimes not, is how they put it. And that has led some people to believe that, these people might have been occupants of a UFO helping out George Washington. Once again, kind of an outlandish story. It would be a history-changing event if it was true. But when you come upon a story like that, it's just too good not to put in.
Yeah, and it's well, regardless, I think it's important in just the whole sociological, mythological side, to record this stuff so we know it's a part of our history.
Mm-hmm. It is. You're right.
One question, getting into kind of the overall, I know some of these people you had talked with or work with like to refrain from using the phrase UFO, and they use UAP and unidentified aerial phenomena because they feel there's a lot of baggage with the term UFO. I know you used UFOs in your book. Did you run across that, and what is your opinion of that debate?
Well, I think, we used UFOs because I think everyone, can identify. They know immediately what UFO, when they see those three letters in a book or a document, they know what we're talking about. I think it was Ruppelt who came up. In fact, I know it was he who came up with that term because he wanted some kind of an umbrella term to take into account all these different shapes, sizes, and things that people were seeing. Before that, it was flying saucers. Before that, it was Foo Fighters. Before that, it was a number of other strange things. But I didn't really run into that much. But, if we had, I think you have to stick with what people know. And there's going to be debates on everything. But just so as not to confuse people, we just used, I tried to use UFOs from the point where Ruppelt had come up with the term. And before that, we used flying saucer or unidentified aerial object or whatever. But once he had come up with the term, we felt pretty comfortable just using it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you tell someone another term anyway, they're going to ask, well, what are you talking about? And you're going to have to say, well, UFO.
Right, exactly.
So you can't get around it. And I think it's, and it has some baggage, but books like yours and being brave enough to get out there and face that ridicule factor will hopefully eventually change that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look at myself, I don't look at myself as a UFO researcher. I look at myself as a reporter. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of new to this, and I thought it would be an interesting and kind of a entertaining subject for people to pick up the book and read it and kind of make their own decision at after finishing it. But, in the course of doing that, I ran into a lot of UFO researchers, and I say this in the book, and it's for everyone. It's for people like you. It's for people like George Norrie. It's for Keith Chester and Jerry Clark and these people. These are the people who are keeping this going. And as you say, and always facing a wall of criticism to a certain degree. But, years ago, hundreds of years ago, there were people who thought the world was round, where most people thought it was flat. And it was those people who kept on pushing this, and it turns out they were right. I have a feeling that this is how it's going to be with the UFO researchers, is that they're the ones who are in the forefront of this. They're the ones who are taking the hits, taking the ridicule. Someday they're going to be proved right, and they're really the heroes of this thing. They're the people who saw the light first, and who knows, in 10 years, maybe tomorrow, 10 years, 100 years, people look back on them and say, if it wasn't for them, we would not have found the answer to this.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a positive way to look at it, and I hope that does ring true at some point. The answers come out. But what do you think, speaking of answers and the people holding those answers, after doing all this work, you kind of had, at the beginning of the show, talked about what the military may or may not know. How much do you think they do know? You're probably familiar with John Alexander and his view that they don't know a whole lot, or at least they're too incompetent to really put the pieces together. And they don't want to admit that. Mm-hmm. What's your feeling?
Well, I'm exactly 50-50 on that. Okay. On one hand, there's a lot of evidence that would lead you to believe that they know what they are and that they are covering it up and don't want us to know. On the other hand, just as you mentioned, there's a lot of evidence that says they have no idea what they are and they're covering that up as well. Mm-hmm. the way that they did a lot of their investigations was there was never an open, broad-minded investigation. It was always couched with the idea that we're going to study UFOs to see if they're a threat to our national security. And they could say at the end of these quote-unquote investigations, we have found that they are not a threat to our national security, therefore they don't exist. Okay, but now, what would you rather? Would you rather the military know what they are and we're keeping this huge secret from us, a secret that would span all of human history? Or would you rather that they don't know what they are and they're powerless to know what they are, and that's what they're keeping secret from us, that they're powerless to protect us from something that they don't know what it is? I will tell you this. I am 100% sure that they know more about it than they're telling us. Mm-hmm. There's evidence in the book from people like Gordon Cooper, who was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts who had 2 UFO encounters in his career before he became an astronaut. And one of them, in which a film crew that he was in charge of took moving film and photographs of a UFO landing at Edwards Air Force Base at the end of the 50s. So those photographs went somewhere. These stories about UFOs trailing ships in World War II in the Pacific. Every major ship has a ship's photographer. Now, if a UFO is tailing a ship for 4 hours, you can be sure that photographer is out there taking pictures of it. Where are those pictures? The military knows more about them than they're letting us know. I know that much for a fact. The problem is what do they know? Do they know what they are, or they don't know what they are? Either way, it's a little bit frightening. But
right.
Are we ever going to know? That's the problem.
Right, and I think you pose a good question, a couple good questions. Are we ever going to know? But also the idea that if Alexander, let's say, is correct, and all of this data has been collected, but because they're so afraid to look at it or to coalesce a group to look at it, that's so tragic that would be the case. And frightening that sort of incompetence would happen, where they have this information in front of them, but they refuse to look at it because they're too afraid, or these goofy, silly reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, that could very possibly be the case.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem from the beginning is that the U.S. military were the people designated to investigate this thing, and they're the worst people to investigate it. I mean, the only people I can think who would be worse would be politicians.
Yeah.
Okay? This is something that should be turned over to the scientific community. It should be funded, and have them look into it using basic scientific methods. And I think if that happens, and other UFO researchers that I quote in the book agree, if that happens, we'll be that much closer to figuring out what this is.
I agree with that statement 100%. You can't trust politics or military. They lie to each other. They lie about everything. Everything's secret. You can't trust anything coming from that. I agree. And then finally, I wonder if, I know sometimes putting these stories together and putting all of this analysis together, you ask some questions about, who are these guys looking at us, the guys flying these UFOs, and who they are. And sometimes when you're putting together so many stories, you kind of feel like maybe you're getting a sense of these guys. Do you feel you have a sense at all of who is flying these things, what their motives are, and what they're doing?
Yes, I've come up with a theory. I think what they are is, I think that they're time travelers from our future, and they're coming back here to watch history as it's happening.
That's interesting. I used to ask people, this is a question that I always think about, that I'll ask people, do you believe that we'll ever travel in time one day? And if they say yes, that's almost akin to you saying there are probably time travelers here right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, there could be. There could very well be.
That's possible.
Einstein, proved that you can travel in time. In fact, we're traveling time all the time. We're traveling in time right now. You and I and everyone on this planet is traveling towards the future. But the question that kept coming back to me was, if you have the technology to create an aircraft, a flying aerial machine or an unidentified aerial machine that can go 7,000, 10,000 miles an hour, that can go so fast it goes in the blink of an eye, okay, then why are you riding 100 feet off the wing of a B-17 bomber as it's dropping its bombs on Berlin? Why are you doing that? Unless you wanted to see something up close. And that's the only conclusion that I could come to, is that, they might be historians coming back. They might be tourists coming back. Mm-hmm. But I get a feeling that, and especially the fact that these things spike during times of war or preparing for war, I just have a feeling they're people who are coming back from our future to see history being made. I mean, if we had the option, wouldn't you do it? I would do it. Go back and see how the Civil War was fought, or the Revolutionary War was fought, or the Trojan War was fought. I mean, who wouldn't take advantage of something like that? That's what I believe. After dealing with this for about 3 years, there's no evidence that they're little green men from Mars. There's no more evidence of that than if they're time travelers. My theory is it's the people from our future who have come back and they're seeing history as it's being made.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I mean, did you run across, and I have in the past, military personnel that you had talked to feeling that they had an abduction experience?
Not an abduction experience, but I will say that I had conversations with someone who was an employee of, let's say, an unnamed 3-letter government agency. Okay, a very nice person, helped me in some ways with the book, but at every turn tried to steer me in the direction of saying that what people are seeing are SR-71 recon planes, stealth fighters, meteors, Venus, seagulls, everything. They would not admit to me that there might be something there, and would make up stories about gremlins and all this stuff. Okay, that's one of the people that I know in the intelligence services almost seem to go out of their way to get me to think that these things weren't real. That's about as close as I can answer to the question you asked, but I thought that was unusual.
Yeah, that is very strange, and I've heard that before too. And it makes you wonder what those guys really know. Why are they so adamant on making you believe that?
Exactly. And this person was and they were nice about it. And I knew exactly what I was doing and read a lot of what I was doing before the book ever came out. And I thought I presented a lot of compelling evidence, basically reporting on what others had already reported. But they would not back down. They kept saying, oh, no, those UFOs they saw over those silos, those ICBMs. So that was just an SR-71 flying over, and I know that is not the case.
Right. I guess my final question, real quick, just popped into my mind. From 1 to 10, how confident are you on your future visitor theory?
I'm going to say about a 9.
Oh wow, so pretty confident, but it's a good one. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I'm excited. I haven't finished the book, but I'm going to write a review on it for our magazine. It's always real exciting when new authors come out, and we've had a few lately writing books, and especially a great author who's done some really interesting research to put together some great stories. Thank you so much for your work and for being on the show.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I had a good time, and thanks very much.
Oh, do you have a website, by the way? We could.
All right. Yeah. You can go. People can go to mackmaloney.com, and there'll be links there to order the book and to see some of the other stuff that we've done. The book came out yesterday, and it can be ordered through Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or it's put out by Penguin Books, so it's at every bookstore across the country starting yesterday.
All right, great. Thank you again, and I wish you much success.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mac. And it is a great read, such a very interesting book. So go check that out, or UFOs During Wartime. And next week, join us. We're going to have another great guest. Be sure to check openminds.tv and UFO Daily News for the latest news. A lot of the news we talked at the beginning of the show. You can see pictures and videos and everything at our websites. Talk to you later, people.